This is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy. Be sure to check out our Facebook group, our YouTube channel, and our newsletter, and our great sponsors, Abitiva Casa, Italy Rooting, and Phil Italy. And my guest today is award-winning author Carmen Amato. So welcome, Carmen. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat about all things Italian background.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And you have another interesting background, which we'll touch on too, which I found fascinating. But, just to start off, where did your family come from in Italy, and when did they arrive in the United States?
My family is mostly from Calabria, and I think they date back to just before the turn of the 20th century. And the first to come over was my great-grandfather, Nicola Sestito. And he came into Rome, New York, which is my hometown. And so that's on my mother's side. My grandmother, her family also came from Calabria a little bit later in the 1910s.
Yeah, so they came relatively early before the big wave, I guess.
I think so, although I know that my grandmother's parents came through Ellis Island. And I'm not sure what year Ellis Island was stood up and started recording.
Yeah, I should know this, but I think it was either the very, very late 1800s or early 1900s when they opened it up. Do you know why they wound up in Rome? How they wound up in Rome, New York?
Well, my grandfather's parents, so my great-grandfather, the Sestitos, I don't know why they came to Rome, but of course there's a really, really big Italian-American community in Rome. And if you look at the map of upstate New York, you've got Rome, Utica, Syracuse, Verona, all city names that trace back to Italy. And there's been a very large Italian-American community up there for years. So I think it was kind of a natural movement up from New York City into that region. Lots of mills in that area, Revere Copper and Brass Rolling Mill being the biggest, in my memory anyways. And all of those mills, all that manufacturing was reinforced by the waterways. So it's a nexus between the Erie Canal, the Mohawk River, the Hudson, all those waterways and the manufacturing needed workers, and the Italian workers moved up into that area. So my great-grandfather started working at Revere. Oh, golly, I have it written someplace. He started in 1909, something like that. Before it was just Rome manufacturing. Then it became Revere, and he worked there until through the 40s.
Wow, that's a long time.
Long time.
Yeah, and that's it. The people came in through Ellis Island. Well, actually, prior to Ellis Island, when they came in through what's it? I can't think of the name now. But when they came in before that, they had basically Castle Garden. They had no work really, and people just the story goes is that there was a big snowstorm in New York City, and the Italians had nothing to do, so the city recruited them to clean the snow, and they got the reputation of being hard workers. And some of these mining places, the railroads, then started recruiting them to go out and work in these industries. And then I guess word got out back to Italy that the workers were needed here, and that's how it all got started. Incredible story. But they had a rough life. They had a rough time when they got here.
They had a rough time in Rome. There's a section of town called East Rome, and my great-grandfather was one of the first home buyers to own his own home on First Street in Rome.
That's fantastic. Is the house still there? It's still there?
I think so.
Wow.
That neighborhood, which I actually described in one of my books, the streets are very narrow, and all of the houses almost all of them are these double deckers. And so you've got the, family upstairs, family downstairs, all clapboard houses. And another great great uncle, I guess, was an architect who built some of those houses.
Wow, that's cool. Yeah. See, we don't associate with the early Italians with trades like being architects and things like that, you know. But and it was probably an architect back in Italy or learned from back there. So now, so when you were growing up, was it still, did you grow up still mostly in an Italian neighborhood, or was it by that time mixed?
By the time I was growing up in the 60s, my grandfather, son of that first Nicola Sestito, came to Rome. He had moved out of the Italian neighborhood of East Rome and into kind of a newish neighborhood where he built a house. I grew up with my grandparents. It was a duplex, but a ranch style duplex. So they lived on one side and my family lived on the other side. So we grew up very close to our grandparents, which was really super. But he was still very much, I think, part of that, even though our neighborhood was not particularly Italian. And my grandfather, like his father, worked at the Revere Copper and Brass Rolling Mill. And he belonged to the Liberty Club and played saxophone in the Liberty Club band. And the center of Italian life in Rome still was along a main artery called Dominic Street. And I used that setting, my hometown setting, and Dominic Street for a book series, the Galliano Club books. And I had someone write to me the other day saying that she had the opportunity to drive down Dominic Street. And she wrote me and she said, every time I'm on that street, I think of you, which was really nice.
That's great. That's great. And I envy you for being able to put out these, I guess they're historical fiction books, yeah.
Correct.
And boy, I dream of doing it, and I've said this before, it's creating the characters that is, you really have to know how to put that together, right?
I was lucky enough to be in the class of 2019 for my hometown's Arts Hall of Fame. And at that time, I had only been writing mysteries set in Acapulco. I had spent a lot of time in Mexico during my professional career, and I had this book series, and it was doing very well. And someone at the awards ceremony asked if I'd ever write a mystery set in Rome. And I really couldn't imagine a contemporary drama set in Rome. I just couldn't make that connection. And I laughed and said, well, who knows? And it was during the pandemic when my mom was in a senior living facility and having a very difficult time in upstate New York, which of course had a very tough lockdown regime. So I'd call her every night. I'm in Tennessee, outside Nashville. And to cheer her up, I'd ask her questions about growing up in Rome, being a young girl, her family, culture, things in Rome, kind of getting back to my roots and hers too. And she had great stories. So I was able to take those stories and the stories that my grandfather used to tell of when he was a deputy sheriff in Oneida County during Prohibition. And those two sources of great, rich storytelling really let me create those characters, let me reimagine Rome as it was in the 1920s and build the book story, the books around all those stories and those characters.
So so when your grandfather was the sheriff, were they bringing alcohol from Canada, like, up through the lakes or through the canals and stuff?
They were bringing, yes, alcohol over the border. They were bringing it up from New York City. But it was amazing to connect his stories with research because apparently there were enough barns and rural properties in that region So the people were creating stills and brewing beer right there. So one of his best stories was being instructed by the sheriff to stake out the cemetery in Rome because bootleggers had staged what they thought was a fake funeral and buried bootleg whiskey in a coffin to be dug up later. So my grandfather, Joe, decides he's not going to stay in a cemetery all night by himself. And he ropes in his best friend, Hank Rizzuto, who sells insurance, so my grandfather with his one gun gets his buddy Hank, and they are in the cemetery cowering behind a headstone, waiting for the bootleggers to come back. And it is cold, and it is like a wintry night, pitch black, leaves rustling, wind howling. And they waited, and they waited 10, maybe 15 minutes, and they scrambled out of there, figuring if the bootleggers came for their liquor, they were welcome to it, but they weren't staying in the creepy cemetery any longer.
Oh, that is
So
funny. That's funny.
that was one of the stories he told. And it is given a little more emphasis when you realize that his friend Hank's son, John, became the president of the fashion house Givenchy in New York. He was
Wow.
the U.S. president of Givenchy America. So it's amazing how all these things connect.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.co. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co. Yeah. My dad was he was a photographer for the New York Daily News, and he had a couple of different mafia connections, and he had a couple of pictures of guys laying in the street. But the most fascinating story that he ever told about something like that was the Gallo brothers were well known mafia in Brooklyn, and my father's beat was Brooklyn at the time. And they liked to have their picture taken, especially Joey Gallo. He loved to have his photo taken, be in the paper. And one day my father was taking his picture, and some guy kept pushing the camera away. And my father went to Joey and he said, "What happened? I can't take your picture anymore." And he said, "Why? What happened?" He said, "That he won't let me take your picture." And he said, "Don't worry about him. Uh, he's going to be taken care of." A week later, they found this guy in the trunk of a car. And my father was like, "I hope I didn't have anything to do with that." Uh, but that's a cool story. So did your mom talk about, because I love to hear stories about, especially in different parts of the country, because I kind of know how it was here. But during World War II, what it was like in upstate New York. She mention anything about that?
Yes, because she was in high school during World War II.
Yeah, it's
And I
like my
really
parents.
think, yeah, that was a formative experience for her. And she would talk about doing drives for rubber and metal to collect that. And of course, they always had a garden, a victory garden, but that was just normal to have a garden. And friends getting letters from overseas. So she also said she remembered when it was VE Day and Pearl Harbor. She played the organ for a church, and she was practicing in the church. And golly, she must have been 14. And one of the nuns came to her and told her to go home. And that's when she went home and found out about Pearl Harbor. So
Wow. Gee, that's something.
she was the oldest of three kids, and so they all had a bit of a different experience, but it was very critical for her, the whole high school experience during World War II.
Yeah, my mom, she was probably just getting out of high school. My father was at 18 with Pearl Harbor, so he was a little bit older, but he wanted to be a combat photographer, and he wasn't a professional photographer yet. He did work for the Daily News, and they told him, "Well, don't worry, we're going to send you to Signal Corps School in New Jersey, and you'll get your chance because the life expectancy of a combat photographer is 6 months."
Oh,
Imagine. But he had a punctured eardrum and they dismissed him from the Army. He got a discharge from the Army and he was able then to become a photographer more quickly because all the photographers were in the Army.
right, right.
But yeah, when you don't think about it when you watch some of those newsreels that these photographers are they're right in the mix of things. And I was watching something just recently where they showed that. And yeah, I mean, they don't have a gun. They just have a camera.
Well, what about his parents thinking, well, our son wants to be a combat photographer? Did they encourage it, discourage it?
I never thought to ask my dad. I know that my mother told the story that my grandfather thought he was like promoted to a general because right out of boot camp they sent him to this technical school and he got 2 stripes like right away. And my father thought it was a mistake. He went to I guess the office and he said, "Hey, everybody's got stripes in there, and I just got it." They said, "Don't worry, everybody in the signal car gets 2 stripes and the T for the technical thing." But yeah, we lived in or they lived in Queens, and he was stationed in New Jersey, so it wasn't that far away, and he was able to go back and forth for that period of time. And then, yeah, he got discharged. But my mom's brothers, she had she had 4 brothers in the war at the same time, and they all came back, thankfully. They all
My great uncles were also in the war. And one of my uncles, let's see, great uncle, so my grandfather's brother, Nicky, I remember my mother saying when he would come to visit, Uncle Nicky was at Anzio. And this, I had no, I was a little kid. I had no idea what she was talking about, but it seemed like such a marvelous word, Anzio, Anzio. And Uncle Nick was missing part of one finger. And so I, a little kid concocted this very romantic seeming image of Uncle Nicky and how, he had lost his finger at Anzio, whatever this one, interesting place was. Later I found out, it was a terribly tragic and bloody battle, and that Uncle Nicky had lost his finger long before he got to the Army in a household accident. So it kind of dimmed that light a little.
Well, one of my mother's brothers, he wanted to go in the Army. He was blind in one eye. And so when he read the eye chart, because they had so many guys going, I guess they weren't paying that close of attention. So he read the eye chart. They had him cover one eye, and then they said, "Okay, switch." So he just switched hands. He read the eye chart with the same eye twice. And then when he was taking target practice, he had to look down the barrel of the gun with the wrong eye. And they said, "No, look," he said, "I can't see out of that." So they told him he would never go overseas. They were going to leave him in. I don't know why, but and then he was fluent in Italian. So they sent him to North Africa to be an MP guarding Italian prisoners.
Yeah. The language skills must have been so critical.
Yeah. And he said that the Italians were getting they were giving them, macaroni and meat and tomatoes to make tomato sauce. And the GIs were getting junk, stuff in a can. So he used to go eat with the prisoners because they were having better food.
I think a lot of families have these great kind of stories. I
Yeah.
hope they
And
are.
so, and so many, I've talked to several that they connected, that whether it was their grandfather or their father or their uncle connected with family when they were over there because, they came from Campania or Puglia or Calabria and such. And they met cousins that they probably wouldn't have met had it not been for the war. Not that that's the way you want to meet your cousins.
Yeah,
So now
Go ahead.
your real career was very interesting. So were you a spy or?
I was an intel officer with the CIA for 30 years. This is true. Most of my career was focused on technical collection, counter drug issues, and I spent a lot of time overseas. I was lucky enough during my career to be able to travel, and I did make it back to Italy several times. Um, very, very nice vacation moments. But yes, I retired 9 years ago to write fiction full time.
So is it like they show on television where some guy in a dark suit with sunglasses comes and taps you on the shoulder and says, "We want
No,
you"?
no, I got recruited out of graduate school at the University of Virginia to do analysis. I did that for a few years and then moved on to technical issues. So it wasn't terribly, dramatic recruitment situation. And I was never the kind of officer who spoke in back alleys and met agents. And although I did, at one point, I was the executive officer for the office that created those little James Bond gizmos.
Really?
So that was very fun.
So that is real. They do have stuff like that.
They do have stuff like that, yes. And some of it is in the museum at CIA headquarters.
Oh, really? Yeah. So
Yeah,
the
it's
little
a whole museum.
so the pens and things like that, that stuff's real.
Yes.
But it must have been exciting. You must have been exposed to a lot of things that probably would scare the rest of us if we knew what was really going on.
Maybe a little bit. I think what I really took out of it that I was able to parlay into my fiction career is all these different people you meet. Lots of different personalities, some people with something to hide, some people who want to convince you to believe something a certain way, lots of people with technical know-how, and just a lot of varied personalities that I could cherry pick these interesting characteristics and put them into fiction.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Sure. Yeah. That's a good background. So are you able to give us like a story that might intrigue us a little bit without getting yourself into trouble?
um, well, I'll tell you a funny story. I was traveling in the South Pacific by myself and planning to take a little moment and do some scuba diving in Fiji. Well, the flight I was on came into the airport. Now, Fiji is all islands, right? And speaking of a World War II connection, that's where they had the dress rehearsal for the landing on Guadalcanal.
Oh, really? Wow. I didn't know that. Yeah.
So I'm landing on the main island of Fiji, and it's 2 weeks after the government was toppled for the second time in like 6 months by a coup. And it was a racially inspired coup. Fiji had been a British colony, I guess you'd call it. And the British had imported workers from India to grow sugarcane. But by law, all the actual land belongs to the native Fijian. But as the Indian population grew, eventually an Indian prime minister was elected. This did not sit well, and a army colonel named Stephen Rambuka toppled the Indian prime minister who'd been elected, installed the supreme Fijian chief, a man named Ratumara, and then it looked like things weren't going the way Colonel Rambuka wanted. He toppled or moved aside Ratumara, and he became chief of state, and he stayed chief of state. So about 2 weeks after the second coup, I land in the country. It's about 2:00 in the morning, and I get my scuba gear in my suitcase and get into the first taxi I see outside the airport with, and ask him to take me into the capital city about a 20-minute drive away to the hotel. Well, it's an Indian cab driver, and we set off, and it is pitch black. I mean, just inky darkness. And it's kind of it's a major highway, but it's also very rural, not a lot of traffic on the road. Well, we are stopped at a roadblock, you know, just coming out of the airport. And it's a roadblock manned by one Fijian soldier. Now, I have to admit, Fijian men are very tall. They are very good looking. And as far as I could tell, they all go running at about 5 o'clock in the morning. They are kind of famous for being UN peacekeepers. So they have a good military tradition. Well, this particular soldier is wearing the traditional uniform, which includes the traditional Fijian kilt. So, he is fully armed. He's wearing a military uniform top. He's wearing the Fijian kilt in lieu of trousers. And he's about 7 feet tall, and I can say extremely good looking. So the taxi stops. I don't really know what to do. The taxi driver seems to have become immobile, and he's not saying anything. So I roll down my window, and the soldier pokes his head in and says, "Hello," like this deep, rich hello, soap opera, fabulous, romantic voice. And I hand him my passport, and he stands up and he's looking at the passport. The driver, once again, not saying a thing, not offering any identification, nothing. And the soldier comes back with my passport and he hands it to me through the open window and goes, "Goodbye. Goodbye." And we went on our way. I've had some interesting encounters. I haven't yet written in a Fijian soldier into any book, but I have to say for Casablanca-like romantic drama, they can't be beat.
That's so funny. That's so funny. So, because this is so curious to me. So, when you traveled for work as an agent, did you have to do anything special, or you were just traveling going to another country as a U.S. employee or something like that?
I can't get into particulars.
Yeah, yeah. You answered my question. I get it.
Yeah.
It's so intriguing. I have my one of my old bosses and somebody that I just met recently. They were both stationed in the army in Germany during the Cold War. And, Carl, who I just met at the Italian club just recently, he said he sat there with a headset listening to one guy. He had to listen for one guy. That was his job. Listen. And when this guy came on, he had to listen to what this guy had to say. And my old boss, he was there he was a teletype communications guy. And he said we were, right on the border basically. And we had instructions if the tanks passed a certain point, we had to blow up this bunker while we were in it.
Scary stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Scary stuff. My one regret is that in all the travels I have had, I never made it to Calabria.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah. And it really wasn't until later in my career when I started asking a lot of questions of my mother, and my oldest sister started doing a lot of genealogical research. So when I was in college, I actually did my senior year in Paris and was able to travel with the really close friend whose family is also Italian. And we went to Milan and we went to Venice and down to Torino, Bari, Brindisi. We went all over, but I really felt like I missed an opportunity to do a detour and go to Reggio and go to Serra San Bruno, which is where my grandmother's parents were from. So,
Well, it's not too late.
It's
not too late. You could still go.
I think, yeah, I think I need to plan a trip.
Yeah, my Calabrian roots is that my third great-grandfather was the Count of Montebello in Calabria. My grandmother comes from two noble families, and Piromallo is that family. And they had, I learned from my cousin over there. I didn't know any of this stuff growing up. I found this out all by myself. But my cousin over there, she found that they had at least 7 houses throughout Calabria, Campania, Sicily. They were wealthy, very wealthy, and that's her father's family. Her mother's family was even more wealthy, even more so. So when we went there, they treated me like I was the count. I mean, it was amazing. I mean, they brought me to 2 of the homes. One of them, actually, we got to go into both of them. One of them is rented. The other one is a big stone palazzo that unfortunately is in disrepair, and the town wanted to buy it, and the guy who owns it wouldn't sell it. And we were outside on his land having a picnic, and I said at one point, I said, "Doesn't he care?" And they were, how Italians, they were like,
Yeah.
"He might come out later." And he did come out, and he asked us if we wanted to go into the house, and it was really fantastic to go in there. But my 2 travel regrets, because I worked for Chase, and I was supposed to go to Switzerland, and it got canceled, and I almost was gonna go to Russia. I would have loved to have been to Russia. And I worked with somebody who he used to go there often, and I said, "What is it?" He said, "It's like nothing you've ever seen before." He said, "If there's a traffic jam," he said, "they'll just go on the other side of the road and drive." He said, "There's like no rules, you know, pretty much anything goes."
But I think there is something about being Italian and going back to Italy, even if you don't speak Italian or, your family hasn't been particularly traditional in maintaining customs and things. It just feels very comfortable and homey.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know, every time I have been, there's a sense of going home, even, I don't speak Italian. I know a few words, but you can get by pretty much. It has always felt very comfortable.
Yeah, and in the cities, there's always somebody who speaks English. But like you said, you could get by pretty well. Our first trip was like 30 years ago, and I don't know what I know now. I wish I did. But my wife said to me, she said, "You love it here," and I said, "I'm among my people." I said, "I
Mhm.
feel like I'm home."
Right.
And I tell people when they ask me about where, going to Italy and they're going to Rome, I said, "Do you know where your family's from?" And they'll say, "Yeah." I said, "Are you going to the hometown?" I don't know anybody there. I said, "It doesn't matter. When you get there, you're going to feel like you're supposed to be there. And
Mhm.
somebody will come up to you probably and ask you who you are and why you're there."
Yes. And frankly, after, writing for a few years, and I have a little snippet about my grandmother's parents and her, unfortunately, criminal father. I've had people reach out, email me. I've had cousins connect that I didn't even know I had these cousins. Genealogical researchers who have a tiny piece of the puzzle. But to make a long story short, in I think it was July 1912, my great grandfather, Giuseppe Amato, shot his neighbor in a tenement in Hartford, Connecticut. And the neighbor's wife and Giuseppe's own wife, who was pregnant with, I believe, baby number 6 at the time. He got away, disappeared out of the tenement neighborhood of Hartford, Connecticut, and was never seen from again. The neighbor, Giovanni Tassone, died. The neighbor's wife recovered, but my great grandmother, Giuseppe's wife, passed away 3 days later. And all the children from that family were parceled out to their godparents. And some of them, they kind of lost touch with each other. I think the oldest was only 5 or 6. So I have a little story about that on my website, carmenamato.net. And it's been amazing how many people I have virtually met through that family history.
Yeah, wow. That's a sad story. Did they know why he did it?
different theories. My oldest sister, who is the one who actually discovered all this because my grandmother never spoke of it.
Mm-hmm.
She had a story that her parents went back to Italy and died in a train crash, leaving their children in the United States. Very hard to know if she really knew the truth or not. So I haven't written about that in fiction.
Well, I'll tell you, I'll tell you, and I learned this, a couple of weeks ago. I interviewed somebody in Corona that happened to know my cousin. They're both, she's 90, my cousin's 92, and I didn't know that they knew each other until I mentioned it. So anyway, I called my cousin and I said spoke to Tony Q, and she told me that you used to go to lunch with her and all of this stuff. So we were talking, and he said, "Do you know the story about our great grandmother?" So I said, "No." I said, "Nobody ever mentioned it." He said, "Well," he said, "when I was maybe 14 or 15," he said, "I knew a little bit of Italian." He said, "When I would walk into the room and grandma and my mother or somebody would be talking, when I walk in the room, they would stop talking." So he said, "I went to the army, the Korean War. When I came back, because I had mentioned I used to play cards with my grandmother." He says, "I was playing cards and I asked her, 'Grandma, how come you always would stop talking when I came in the room?' I can't." And he said, "Come on, you have to tell." No. So finally, he got her to talk, and she said that her mother's, let's see, was her mother. So her mother's sister got pregnant by some guy in Italy, I guess late 1800s, early 1900s, whatever. And my great grandmother said, "Well, you know what you have to do? You have to marry him." And she said, "No, he won't marry me." So she said, "Well, then you have to do the other thing." And she said, "I can't do." So my great grandmother killed this guy somehow. Well,
Oh.
my wife said, "How did she kill him?" I said, "I don't know." We have a photo of this woman with my grandfather, and she does look like a tough, but I said, maybe she was maybe she knew the potions or something like that. I said, I don't know how she did it, but apparently this guy didn't do the right thing, so she took care of it.
Well, we know that my great-grandfather had a barber shop in the basement of this tenement house where he was living with his family. And he sold the barber shop and then bought a handgun and gave as his name as the handgun purchaser the name of the man who had bought the barber shop, complicating that guy's life.
Wow.
And the neighbor who was shot, Tassone, had been known as someone with a bad temper who owned a gun.
Mm-hmm.
And his wife had tried to leave him once. He got a private detective and dragged her home. So, we've all posited that Tassone had maybe threatened the Amatos or something. I know there's another theory that a cousin had that perhaps Tassone had had an affair with Amato's wife, my great grandmother, and there was jealousy involved, so who really knows? There was another that maybe there was a contract out on Tesson and Giuseppe Amato wanted to collect the contract money by killing him. We don't think he meant to kill his own wife or shoot Tesson's wife either, but they kind of got in his way and he got nervous, it sounds like. I've spent a lot of time researching this on newspapers.com.
Yeah, wow, that's some story, and he got away with it. They
He
never
got
found him.
away with it, but where did he go?
Yeah,
And what happened to him next? Of course, in that day and age, he could have renamed himself anything,
sure.
and nobody had any pictures of him.
Wow, that's
So
an incredible
didn't know what he
story.
looked like.
Yeah, well, you'll have to work that in somewhere into one of the books for sure.
I did write the Galliano Club series. It's 4 books, and the first one, I'll kind of show it off here. It did win the Silver Falchion Award for Best Historical, of 2023 Killer Nashville International Conference. So I'm very proud of it. It's a great saga that spins out over 4 books, 3 full novels and a prequel. And a lot of my grandfather's stories formed the backbone of that. But I didn't put in anything about a murderer who escapes and is never seen from again. So I might have to write a sequel to the series or something.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So before we go, where could people? I know you have a website, but what's the website, and where could people buy the?
You can find my website at carmenamato.net, and there's a place right on the front page to subscribe to my newsletter, or you can go to the newsletter at mysteryahead.substack.com. And the books are pretty much everywhere that you'd be ordering books, whether it's Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Books A Million. If you are a Kindle reader and you are a member of the Kindle Unlimited program, there is a box set of the complete Galliano Club series that you could read for free if you're a Kindle Unlimited reader. And the audiobooks are coming out very soon. The prequel audiobook, Road to the Galliano Club, is already out. I'm very excited. They are narrated by actor James Frommel, and the rest of them should be out in the next, say, 3 months, certainly by Christmas. So
Fantastic.
excited
That's great. That's
give
great.
them an audiobook. I know a lot of people are enjoying audiobooks on Audible or Spotify or wherever.
Yeah, well, that's super. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, thanks again. I appreciate you being here. Great stories. I loved it.
Well, thanks for having me. It was very nice to talk Italian roots. Don't get to do that too often, but it always is nice to share family stories and fun ideas.
Bet.